Hi everyone, welcome to Lesson 2. In this lecture, we'll be examining early East Asia. I'm going to give you an overview of how early human beings appeared in East Asia and came to populate China, Korea, and Japan. And then we'll focus on the material culture of the Neolithic period. And we'll talk about what Neolithic means. The questions we'll focus on are: how did humans come to inhabit East Asia, and what are the defining characteristics of East Asian Neolithic cultures? However, before we begin, we have to address sort of a larger debate in the field of history about the term prehistory. Part of the task of the History Survey course is to get you thinking about the construction of history, and the term prehistory is one of those ways in which historians mark the past, while it has also fallen out of use by some historians. Part of the issue with the term is its definition and what it actually connotated at the time when the term was created. So prehistory is a term we define now as a time before the invention of writing, and most dictionaries define it as the time in history between the use of the first stone tools by humans and the time in which writing systems were invented. Of course, in different regions, writing systems came into widespread use at different times, so prehistory is technically a different date for many different places. The notion of prehistory began to surface during the Enlightenment in the work of Western scholars who studied the past and who used the word primitive to describe societies that existed before written records. So, as you can imagine, this Western-centric phrase is derogatory, especially since scholars believe that those places that did not have a writing system were understood to be primitive or lesser until the creation of said writing system. However, historians know that there was communication well before the invention of writing, and there are lots of many ways in which people communicated with each other, including sort of orally and other sort of tools. So if we know that people communicated and worked with one another to make settlements, then why should this be considered prehistory? And not just history itself, since after all, most people think of history as the study of past events, not the study of the things that happened before the invention of writing systems. That said, this is a word that you'll encounter even in textbooks, because academics have not been able to sort of settle on different terminology that excludes these derogatory connotations. So prehistory is a convenient term to describe a particular period in time that is demarcated by a lack of a writing system, and you'll regularly come across it, but it is highly problematic. For our purposes, we will be looking at East Asia before the invention of writing. We have a very clear date in East Asia as to when that occurs. So we'll be starting more than 1 million years ago. So more than 1 million years ago, early humans spread from Africa and West Africa during the Pleistocene and appeared in East Asia. Scholars figured this out by investigating DNA. You kind of see this image actually, and it shows you roughly how early humans spread. One important find that scholars point to when thinking about human movement in East Asia was discovered in the 1920s near Beijing. Basically what was found was this cave full of skeletal remains from over 40 individuals. These bones were studied, and it was determined that this was a subspecies of Homo erectus that was then dubbed Peking man. Hence the name Peking. It's the old Romanized version of Beijing. This was found near Beijing. This site has yielded some of the best documented examples of Homo erectus, and from what they found, Peking man could stand erect, he could hunt, make fire, and use chipped stones as tools. There have been many more discoveries found in South China as well, so this is not the only example of Homo erectus in East Asia, but it is one of the most remarkable in terms of the sheer volume of examples. Modern human beings, or Homo sapiens, appeared in East Asia about 50,000 years ago. So during the period from about 50,000 to 10,000 BCE, East Asia was home to numerous groups of hunters, gatherers, and fishermen who used rudimentary chipped stone tools. So what else do we know about these early populations? What we know from archaeology is these people were on the move constantly, searching for food and animals to hunt. It's actually during this period when people from Northeast Asia moved to the Americas, and also from South China and Southeast Asia to the Pacific and Australia. Historians use languages and evolution of language as a way of sort of tracing where people moved early on. And they've found that the 3 major migratory patterns through East Asia were: 1, from North Asia into Mongolia, Manchuria, Korea, and Japan. The 2nd, from China into Tibet and Southeast Asia. And then finally the 3rd, from South China to both Southeast Asia and the islands of the Philippines and Indonesia. These are not the only 3 routes. For example, there's evidence to suggest a route from Southeast Asia to Japan, but these are sort of the common ones you will find if you look this up. So it's really in about 10,000 BCE that there is this great change throughout Eurasia generally. It's often referred to as the Neolithic Revolution. Now, this term is something that could turn up as an ID on a test or a quiz because it's important, and it marks a period in which humans started changing their patterns of behavior. Humans began creating pottery, practicing agriculture, and using domesticated animals. So the Neolithic Revolution, again, from about 10,000 BCE, beginning at that point, is characterized by agriculture. Advanced technology resulted in surplus, which could further support an increasing population. Cultivating crops allowed for denser and more permanent settlements. Town building is another defining feature of this period. There are larger settlements indicating a very sedentary society. Flood control and irrigation systems again allowed for surplus production, so we begin again to see the growth of populations. It's around this time too that we begin to see script to administer surplus and taxes. I mean, only the upper levels of society would be privy to this script since they were running things, but it still is developed. There's also the production of metal tools and weapons. Because tending crops, weaving, and fashioning pots require different sorts of technical and social skills than hunting and gathering, it's really likely, too, that we see skilled elders begin to vie with hunters and warriors for leadership positions. So we stop seeing warriors in positions of power, and we start seeing really skilled elders. Interestingly, the archaeological record we have on these settlements in China, these Neolithic settlements, rely on pretty recent discoveries in the 1970s and 80s. And you can kind of see where they've found different cultures circled in this map. What these finds revealed is that there was an immense amount of diversity among different settlements. There were a dozen or more Neolithic cultures roughly divided by latitude and longitude in what we now call China today. By latitude into the southern rice cultivating zone and the northern millet zone, and again by longitude into an eastern jade zone and a western painted pottery zone, as we discussed in last lecture. Traditionally, the Yellow River Bend has been seen as the cradle of Chinese civilization because of the archaeological record, but there were actually a lot of influences from outside of what we call China today. For example, bronze tools like excavated weapons show the influence of Southeast Asia as a whole on these early settlements. So some general developments kind of give you an idea of what's going on during this period. Again, 10,000 BCE, this is the outset of that Neolithic Revolution period. We start seeing the use of bronze tools and weapons. Stone and metal tools are being used, and clay pots are being fashioned. There's still the cultivation of millet and barley, wheat and peas, so cultivation is occurring, and also domestication of animals. You can see there's slightly different dates for when those animals become domesticated as well. By about 6,500 BCE, we have the cultivation of rice. So that happens pretty early on. But around 2000 BC, that's when we start to see urban cultures, including things like silk production as well. But we're talking about very populated settlements, very early on. So while the areas of northern Vietnam and adjacent southern China were Sinai's, southern Vietnam and Southeast Asia came under the influence of India. So the developments that we'll see in southern China are different than the developments we're going to see in northern China. India, and also Mesopotamia at this time, had highly developed urban cultures with literate bureaucrats, tax collectors, priests, scribes, and people who had been educated in schools, as well as a fully developed agriculture relying on really sophisticated irrigation systems. So these southern regions were heavily influenced by India early on. In the south, the Hemidu culture flourished just south of Hangzhou Bay. Excavations have shown that the Hemidu lived in long communal stilt houses. They were also some of the first Neolithic people to cultivate rice. They also produced lacquered wood and porous black pottery made with charcoal powder, and you can kind of see this to the left here in the slide. Artifacts designed by these inhabitants bear many resemblances to those of insular Southeast Asia. Scholars also suspect that this culture from very early on was a matrilineal one and that women and children had relatively high status. However, finds, archaeological evidence sort of suggests that this changed over time to a patrilineal pattern. In the north, cultures regularly interacted with one another. The Hongshan culture produced spectacular jade objects that were shaped into hallowed ceremonial, dignifying, and decorative items. In fact, Hongshan burial artifacts include some of the earliest known examples of jade working. And you can see some of these examples on the screen. In graves, Hongshan jades were usually placed close to the body of the deceased and clearly were a rare and precious commodity that indicated status. They were generally pierced with holes for suspension or for attachment to textiles or some other material, and probably represented personal ornaments. So you can see to the left here those holes within those jade pieces. They were not only interred in graves, however, these pieces also appear to be handed down for centuries. Common findings were also small animal sculptures, such as the pig dragon jade artifact in this image you see to the right. Also in the north, the Yangshao culture developed a millet cultivating society. We have this excellent example of this site, the Bompo village Neolithic site, where they just investigated. You can see to the left here an image of the ground being dug up and the excavation occurring, a lot of different information, and you'll get to look at this a little bit more in a video I have for you. Archaeology suggests that the Yangshao culture used slash and burn cultivation versus a more permanent intensive agriculture. They again also kept animals, pigs and dogs mostly, although cattle and sheep were around, they were extremely rare. They also crafted pottery, hand-built and painted pottery objects inscribed with ideograms or ideographs, decorated with red and black geometric patterns. And so you see that to the right-hand side of your screen, that geometric patterned pottery. So you'll get the opportunity to hear more about Bompo in this week's short video clip. It gives you some more context for finding the archaeological site and images of the site itself. Sadly, it's not the best video, but it's the best I could find that was not overly flooded with just lots of information. It's pretty short and it was available online, so be sure that you check it out. You get to actually see some of the physical spaces a little bit more. The Eastern Longshan culture, located in the middle of the valley areas of northern China, were most recognized by the production of elegant black, thin pottery thrown on a wheel and fired at really high temperatures. And you can kind of see that here. So now that we've taken a look at Neolithic cultures in China, let's turn our attention to Korean Neolithic cultures. The Korean Neolithic age begins with the Julmun pottery period, which breaks down into two periods as I've listed here on your slides. The period is named after pottery people living at the time produced. The term Julmun means combed pattern and is one of the primary pieces of archaeological evidence we have from the period. These archaeological discoveries, by the way, were quite recent. They started in the 1990s, these digs, and they've really shaped our understanding of the period. So here's a couple examples of that pottery, and you can really see why it is called combed patterned. We know, too, that the period was one of hunting and gathering, as well as small-scale plant cultivation. Early Julmun saw deep-sea fishing and semi-permanent settlements with sort of pit houses. They collected shellfish and other fish, and they ate deer, wild boar, which of course they hunted. Archaeology tells us that over time they began cultivating plants more and more. But this isn't a dramatic, sudden shift at the time, but one that happens over the course of years. People began to rely less on exploitation of natural resources and really began to focus on cultivation. But it really isn't until the Mumun period that we see small-scale cultivation expand, and we see shifting agricultural practices. So the Mumun period is called such because of the Mumun-style pottery this group created. This kind of pottery was very plain and undecorated, and was mainly used for cooking and storage. Archaeologists actually think a new group of people who used new, intensive agricultural techniques like slashing and burning in particular, moved in and actually displaced the Julmun peoples. Archaeology tells us that the Mumun grew millet, beans, peas, and sorghum, but they also used paddy fields and irrigation channels for growing rice. They also used tools such as polished stone tools, knives, axes, chisels, etc. Generally, these peoples occupied sedentary villages located on the banks of rivers or hills adjacent to plains. Their pit houses were rectangular, square, or circular, with a large ovular pit dug at the center of the floor with post holes placed either inside or outside of the pit. There were also large above ground storage buildings supported by posts in many of these settlements as well. The burial practices of the Mulan people are the subject of a lot of literature. There's tens of thousands of these dolmen burial sites that are known from this period throughout Korea. To the left here, you get to see these burial structures here. Most dolmen are very small and lack grave goods, but there's these huge numbers of them. They show that they are probably the graves of just ordinary people, perhaps family or lineage heads. A few, however, are really impressively large, both in their scale and contained goods that show them to be graves of very high status peoples. One thing that separates those sort of smaller graves from the larger ones are bronze weapons that we find within there. And actually, a lot of bronzes from this period are, in fact, weapons that are created. Towards the end of the Mumun period, settlements became larger and there became more social stratification among the people. So multiple classes emerged. With more social division came social conflict and warfare due to the scarcity of resources. So archaeologists really propose that in the late Mumun, there was a period of conflict between groups of people, and this period continues on towards the end of the Mumun. And we begin to find Mumun-esque settlements that appear in northern Kyushu. So this has led many scholars to speculate that during this period, Mumun peoples actually fled to Japan. So this is kind of an interesting point to think about, especially when we move along and talk about Japanese Neolithic cultures. Archaeology tells us that during the Jomon period, this is the Japanese Neolithic period, that there were actually several waves of migration that brought hunter-gatherers to Japan. Jomon means cord-marked, and as you guessed it, it refers to the kind of pottery created by people living in this period. And you can kind of see examples of this that I've posted here. You can see why it's called cord-marked. The pottery was marked with this sort of marks like rope had been wrapped around the pot. These pots became very important for storing large amounts of acorns and berries and chestnuts and other foodstuffs. Members of Jomon society settled in well-chosen locations where the harvesting of surrounding natural resources could reliably feed a community on a year-round basis. So what else do we know about the Jomon peoples? Well, they weren't monolithic. There were several civilizations, not one single society, but about 3 or 4 civilizations that are in Japan during this time. The extent to which agriculture was practiced in the Jomon period is hotly debated. What is clear, though, is that by the end of the Jomon period, societies grew things like hemp and soybeans. So there is agriculture towards the end. During, it's a little bit in question. By the late and final Jomon periods, Jomon communities of northern Japan persisted and continued to elaborate their ceramic, artistic, social, and ceremonial productions in really distinctive ways. Some of their cultural luxury items, like burnished pottery wares and spouted and handled ceramic pots, reflect a growing awareness of distant continental cultures and practices. And you can kind of, again, see this middle ceremonial vessel right in the front here, kind of indicative of this elaboration. Other artifacts, especially beautifully made serving vessels and pottery drums, are obviously the furnishings of grand feasting events that would have been important in maintaining community solidarity and strengthening the growing social influence and leadership of really prosperous elite households within the community. So you also see social stratification in Jomon Japan. During southern Japan's final Jomon period, new cultural influences emanating from Korea were beginning to be felt in Kyushu. You'll recall that those Munmun people are fleeing or perhaps leaving because of conflict. For thousands of years previously, fishermen and traders have been making contact back and forth across the Korean Strait. So this is not news to you, as you know. This was a high area of contact. By the end of the Jomon period, around 300 BCE, and that's a kind of a contested date, but we'll put it there, there became these patterns of unification and consolidation of communities into really one. Very importantly, though, we see the emergence of rice paddy agriculture and yayoi style pottery, which is often how we differentiate between Jomon period and Japanese history to the yayoi period, that rice agriculture and then also the pottery. But we'll be turning back to the yayoi a little bit later. Again, like I said, the Yayoi period roughly coincides with the fleeing of populations from the Korean peninsula in the late Mumun period. So all of this Neolithic period discussion might seem a little dry, but as you can see early on, Neolithic cultures really give us an insight into the origins of East Asian civilizations. Something that seems universally true about Neolithic cultures in China, the Korean peninsula, and the Japanese archipelago is that these cultures were not isolated. They were interacting with one another in their given region. Also, while these cultures had several similar features, they were quite distinct, and geography, as well as environment, were really determining factors in those characteristics. While we give these periods a designation as prehistory too, it is clear from the archaeological record that these were very sophisticated peoples, even if they existed before the advent of the written record.